The alarm was already screaming when I opened my eyes. Not a warning alarm, a damage alarm. There is a difference in. After 30 years in the fleet, my body knew which one it was before my brain caught up. Warning alarms have a rhythm to them, almost polite. Damage alarms do not care about your feelings, they just scream until someone makes them stop, or there is nothing left to scream. I pulled myself upright from the command chair. My neck hurt, my shoulder hurt. Everything hurt actually, but I had learned somewhere around the second year of the war that pain was just information, and right now I had too much other information demanding my attention to add pain to the queue. Status, I said. My bridge crew, all 6 of them, answered at the same time. That was how I knew it was bad. When everyone talks at once, it means no one knows where to start. One at a time, I said. Diaz, Nina Diaz, my weapons officer, was 29 years old and had the eyes of someone twice that age. She did not look up from her station when she spoke. Rail batteries 3 and 7 are offline. Torpedo Bay 2 is sealed due to vacuum exposure. Point defense grid is at 40%. I can still fight, Commander, but we are not what we were. This morning, Petrov, Gregor Petrov, had served on 3 ships before mine and had the kind of calm that only came from surviving things that should have ended him. He was already halfway under his engineering console when he answered. Reactors 1 and 4 are cold. 2 is unstable but running. 3 I can bring back, but I need time, and I need people not to touch anything in the aft section. Lena Chen looked up at me from the navigation console. She was the youngest person on my bridge and the only one who still looked genuinely afraid. I respected that. Fear meant she understood the situation. We are drifting, Commander. Engines are at 30%. We are in the Kharov corridor, approximately 9 light hours from the nearest friendly position, although, she added quietly, I am not certain that position is still friendly. I did not ask her to explain that. I already knew the war had been going badly for 3 years, not the kind of badly where you lose ground and then take it back. Kind of badly where you lose ground and the ground burns behind you as they advance. The Kth Dominion had come to our part of the galaxy 8 years ago, made first contact in the standard way, and then 4 years later delivered an ultimatum that was really more of a warning: submit to Kth governance or face what they called corrective engagement. Humanity said no. The fleet said no louder. Now we were here. I walked to the main viewport. Space looked the same as it always did, which had always struck me as unfair. All this violence, and the stars just sat there, indifferent and cold and beautiful. 2 of my 4 reactors were dead. The hull had been breached in 14 places and sealed in 13. The 14th was what was keeping Torpedo Bay 2 empty of anything except the void. How many? I asked. Everyone on my bridge knew what I was asking. My crew complement had begun the last engagement at 412. My communications officer, a quiet man named Owen Briggs, who had somehow survived everything the Kth had thrown at us for 2 years, pulled up the number on his screen without me having to ask him twice. 173 confirmed alive, Owen said. 41 in medical, 16 more that I cannot account for. I stood with that number for a moment. Not long. There was no time to stand with numbers for long anymore. I had known some of those people since the beginning. I had known Some of them longer than that. There was a mechanic named Dan Hooper who had served under me on my first command and followed me to this ship because he said I kept the coffee machines running better than any other captain in the fleet. I looked at Owen and he shook his head slightly, and I understood that Dan Hooper was in the 14 sections that no longer had air in them. I breathed in. I breathed out. I turned away from the viewport. Commander, Owen's voice had changed. There was something in it. Something careful and uncertain. We are being hailed, Fleet Commander. He paused. It is the Kaith. The bridge went very quiet, not the quiet of fear. Exactly, though there was some of that. It was the quiet of people who had just realized that the situation had become something different from what it was 10 seconds ago. Put it on speaker, I said. The voice that came through was translated, of course. Kaith did not have voices like ours. What came through our translation system was something smooth and almost musical, carefully modulated. The Kaith were extraordinarily good at appearing reasonable. It was, I had come to understand, one of their primary tactics. Commander Sorokina, my name is Athol Vreth, Envoy Prime of the Kaith Dominion Diplomatic Division. I am speaking to you from a ceasefire vessel, which under Galactic Convention carries full diplomatic immunity. I want you to know first and sincerely that I am sorry for your losses. What has happened here is a tragedy, and the Dominion does not celebrate the suffering of any species. I said nothing. I was listening, and I was also looking at the tactical display where the Kaith diplomatic cruiser was now visible, matching our drift with the precise ease of a ship that had full power and no damage and nothing to worry about. It was sleek and bright with those running lights the Kaith used, bioluminescent, blue-green, the color of something alive, and comfortable and completely in control. I have been authorized, Athol Vreth continued, to offer formal terms of settlement. These terms are generous. I want to be clear that the Dominion views humanity not as an enemy to be eliminated, but as a young species that has made understandable but costly errors of judgment. We are offering a path forward. I would ask only that you hear me out. Lena Chen was looking at me. Petrov had stopped working and was looking at me. Even Nina Diaz, who looked at almost nothing except her weapons console, was looking at me. I'm listening, I said. Athol Vreth proceeded to lay out the terms. Humanity would surrender its core worlds. Humanity would accept Kaith governance over its outer colonies. Humanity would decommission its remaining military fleet. In return, humanity would receive what he called protected species status, which meant we would be allowed to continue existing, continue our culture, continue our science, continue our daily lives, simply under Kaith administration. He said all of this in the tone of someone doing a great favor. I noticed as he spoke that Petrov had quietly gone back to work under his console. I noticed that Nina had turned back to her station and was doing something with her hands that she was being very careful to do without making noise. I noticed that Lena had pulled up a navigation screen that had nothing to do with our current position and was running calculations on something she had not been asked to calculate. My crew knew me. I had not said a word. I had not given a signal. But they knew me, and so they were already moving quietly, without being told, because after enough time on a ship together, you do not need words for the important things. Those are Significant terms, I said to Athol. Vireth, they are realistic terms, he replied gently, given the present situation. I would need time, I said. My surviving senior staff. I would need to consult with them before I could give you any kind of formal response. This is not a decision one person can make. There was a brief pause. When Athol Vireth spoke again, I could hear something in his voice that the translation software was not designed to filter out. It was satisfaction, the satisfied tone of someone who has walked into a negotiation expecting it to go a specific way and found that it is indeed going that specific way. Of course, he said, I will extend you 6 hours. Take the time you need. I understand this is difficult. Thank you, I said. We will speak again in 6 hours. I closed the channel. The bridge was silent for exactly 3 seconds. Then I looked at Petrov and said, tell me about that reactor. Petrov pulled himself out from under the console. There was grease on his forehead, and what I was fairly certain was not grease. On his left hand, he looked at me with the expression of a man who has just been given permission to do something he was already planning to do anyway. I can bring reactor 3 back online, he said. Not full power, maybe 60%, but 60% changes things considerably. How long? 4 hours, maybe 3.5. If you let me use Briggs, Owen, I said. You are temporarily reassigned to engineering. Owen Briggs stood up from his communication station without hesitation. He had been a communications officer for 11 years. He was also, because I had required it of everyone on my bridge since the 2nd year of the war, a qualified engineering assistant. He nodded once and followed Petrov toward the corridor without another word. I turned to Nina Diaz. Rail batteries 3 and 7, I can get one of them back, she said. Not both. Battery 3 has physical damage to the housing, but 7 is an alignment issue. I can fix alignment. Do it. It will require manual calibration from outside the hull, she said. It's the way you stay afloat. Fact about the weather. Not complaining, not asking for sympathy, just noting a condition. Take Reyes and Holloway, I said. Full suits. She was already moving. I turned to Lana Chen. She was 24 years old. She had joined the fleet because she believed in something. I could see that belief still in her eyes, slightly battered but present, the way a lamp stays lit in a window during a storm. What are you calculating? I asked. She turned her screen toward me. It was a jump trajectory, an irregular one from a vector and a destination that made no navigational sense unless you had a very specific reason for going there. Reason no one would expect. I looked at it for a long time. Can the Casimir drive handle it? I asked. She hesitated. The Casimir drive was an experiment propulsion system we had been transporting for a research station that no longer existed. It had never been tested in a combat situation. The mathematics of using it inside a gravity well were considered by every physicist who had reviewed the design schematics to be what they called strongly inadvisable. I have been running the numbers, Lena said. The answer is yes. But the margin is not comfortable. When has this war offered comfortable margins? I said, and it was not a question. She almost smiled, almost. There was not quite enough room for a real smile on this bridge today, but she almost managed one, and that was enough. I walked back to my command chair and Sat down, outside the viewport the Keth diplomatic cruiser drifted alongside us, bright and patient and entirely certain that it already knew how the next 6 hours were going to end. I looked at the stars for a moment, cold and indifferent, and beautiful. Then I got to work. 6 hours, that was what Athol Reith had given me, and I intended to use every second of it in ways he had not imagined. When he offered them, Petrov and Owen Briggs had been in the aft engineering section for 40 minutes when I went to see the rest of my crew, not the officers, everyone, 173 people in various states of damage, and I intended to speak to each of them before those 6 hours were up. I started in the medical bay. Dr. Claraworth looked up when I walked in. She was a small woman with bright red hair that she always wore in a tight braid because she said loose hair was a medical liability. She had been on my ship since the beginning. Her hands were clean, which surprised me. And then I understood why she had run out of people to operate on. The ones who were going to make it had been stabilized. The ones who had not made it were no longer in her care. Commander, she said. Doctor, I looked at the rows of cots. 41 people, she had said. I counted 38 visible and assumed the other 3 were behind the dividing curtain at the far end. How many are mobile? 12 can walk, she said. Of those, I would say 8 can perform limited duties if the duties do not involve lifting or rapid movement or vacuum exposure. The other 26 need to stay where they are. I nodded. Then I went cot by cot to each person who was awake. I did not give a speech. I had always found speeches to be somewhat hollow when people were in pain. Instead, I stopped at each person and I asked one question. I asked, "Are you with me?" Some of them answered immediately. A young technician named Paul Garrett, who had a bandage covering most of his left arm, looked at me and said yes before I had finished asking. A gunner named Ren Harrison, who I knew had a fractured collarbone because Clara had told me so, sat up straighter on her cot and said yes with the kind of conviction that made me wish I had 100 more like her. Mechanic named Diane Moss, who had been on my crew for 8 months and who I honestly had not expected to be so certain, said yes without hesitation. And then there was Torres. Carlos Torres was my senior medic. He had been in the bay longer than anyone else. He had a ventilator mask over face and a monitor clipped to his finger, and tubes running in directions I did not examine too carefully. Clara caught my eye and gave me a small shake of her head, which I understood to mean that Torres was stable but not someone who should be making promises. I went to his cot. Anyway, he was awake. His eyes tracked to me as I sat down on the edge of the cot, and I leaned down so he did not have to strain to see me, and I asked him the question. Torres lifted his right hand off the blanket. He turned it palm up. Then he made a fist and extended his thumb, pointing it upward. I put my hand on his arm for a moment. Then I stood up and went back to work. Every person I asked said yes. I want to be clear about that because it matters. Not a single person on my crew, injured or not exhausted or not frightened or not said anything else. That is not something you can manufacture or order into existence. That is something that happens when people have been through enough together that the question of loyalty stops being a question. I left the medical bay and went through the rest of the ship, the engine teams, the damage control crew, The remaining weapons personnel, I asked. Each of them the same thing. I got the same answer every time when I returned. To the bridge, it was 2 hours into our 6-hour window. Reactor 3 was not online. Yet Nina was still outside the hull, with Reyes and Holloway doing something. To Battery 7 with tools that I was confident were not officially rated for the procedure she was performing. Lena was refining her calculations. Owen's voice was audible from the corridor, calm and technical, asking Petrov about conduit connections. I sat down in my command chair and opened a channel, not to the cath, to something else. The fleet had a standard communication network, but standard networks had been compromised twice in the first year of the war. After that, the Admiralty had built a secondary network. That one had been compromised in the second year. What I was opening now was the third layer, the one built after the second, compromised by a group of communications engineers who were angry enough about the situation to be thorough. It required 3 reactor cores just to broadcast on it, which was exactly the kind of specification that made it very difficult to use from a severely damaged ship. I had 3 reactor cores. 2 of them were cold, but reactor 2 was running and reactor 3 was 40 minutes from coming back online. I waited at 2 hours and 38 minutes. Petrov's voice came through the internal channel. Reactor 3 is online, 61% capacity. I activated the deep channel. The broadcast took 11 seconds to compose and compress and encrypt. I had been writing it in my head for the past 2 hours, which meant it was ready when I needed it. It was 2 words: begin Volkov. I sent it and closed the channel. No one answered. I had not expected anyone to answer. Volkov protocol was not the kind of order that required acknowledgement. It required only that someone received it and understood what it meant. What it meant was this: the war was not over. The fleet was not finished, and there was a specific set of coordinates already known to every surviving fleet commander, encoded in the protocol itself, where those who remained were expected to go when those 2 words arrived. I had chosen the coordinates 18 months ago when I first developed Volkov in collaboration with 4 other commanders, all of whom I had to assume were either dead or cut off from communication. I had not told the Kaith about Volkov. I had not told anyone outside that group. It was exactly the kind of plan that only worked if it was never discussed in a situation where it might be overheard. Nina came back inside from her whole work at the 3-hour mark. She sealed her helmet off and pulled off her gloves and looked at me with the expression of someone who had just accomplished something that would not normally be considered possible. Battery 7 is operational, she said. I also found something interesting while I was out there. Tell me. The Casimir drive housing. She set her tools down carefully. It took no damage in the engagement, not even surface damage. It is sitting back there in perfect condition, which, given the state of everything around it, is either extraordinary luck or extraordinary engineering, or both. I said. Or both, she agreed. At the 4-hour mark, I called Lena over. She brought her calculations on a portable screen and stood beside my chair while I read them. She had been meticulous. Trajectory was the kind of thing that looked at first glance like a navigation error, like someone had put in the wrong numbers and produced a destination that made no sense. But when you understood what we were going to do and why it looked like the only number that had ever made sense. Athol Station, the Keith Minions primary logistics hub, the single point through which an estimated 63% of active Keith military supply lines were routed. The station sat deep inside Keith space, inside a layered orbital defense grid that made it, under any conventional analysis, completely unreachable by any human vessel. Under any conventional analysis the drive can do it, I asked. Again, yes, Lena said. She was more certain now than she had been 4 hours ago. The gravity well makes the entry calculation complicated, but I have run it 97 times and the result is consistent. We arrive inside the defense perimeter, inside the station's own orbital shell, where they will never expect us, where it will physically not occur to them to look, she said, because no one has ever jumped inside a defended perimeter from inside a gravity well before. The math has always been considered too difficult. The math, I said, is apparently not too difficult for you. Lena looked at her screen and then at me. No, Commander, it is not. I looked at the 6 crew members on my bridge. I looked at the corridor beyond, where I knew people were working and waiting and trusting that the next hour was going to mean something. I thought about Tors. With his thumb in the air, I thought about Dan Hooper and the coffee machines and the 14 sections where the air had gone. Then I began to write my response to Athreth. It was 3 pages long, because I wanted it to be 3 pages long. I wanted him to read it and feel with every paragraph that the negotiation was going as he had expected. I used formal language. I used diplomatic phrasing. I thanked him for the generosity of the terms. I acknowledged the difficult position that humanity found itself in. I stated that, after consulting with my senior staff, I was prepared to move forward. The response began with the words, "On behalf of humanity, I accept," and then I stopped. I saved the document. I did not send it yet. I looked at Nina. "Ready?" "Yes," she said. I looked at Lena. "Ready?" "Ready," she said. I looked at Petrov through the internal feed. "Ready." "Ready and then some," he said. I opened the channel to Athreth. His face appeared on my screen, and even through the translation interface I could see the composure of someone who had spent 6 hours being completely certain about what was about to happen. He looked comfortable. He looked settled. He looked like a being who had already written the report of his success and was simply waiting for the final line to be confirmed. "Commander Sorokina," he said, "I am glad to see you. I trust 6 hours were useful." "Very much so," I said. "I have prepared a formal response. I am transmitting it now." I hit send. On his screen he would have seen the document appear. He would have seen the first line, "On behalf of humanity, I accept." He never got to the second line because the second line did not exist, and because I had already looked at Nina Diaz and nodded once, and because Nina Diaz had spent 3.5 of those 6 hours preparing for exactly this moment. Every rail battery that could fire fired, every torpedo tube that was not sealed by vacuum opened. The point defense grid, reduced to 40%, contributed everything it had left. We fired at 0 range. Athelfrith's image vanished from my screen as his communications array took the first impact. His diplomatic cruiser had no military shielding. Diplomatic vessels never carried military shielding because, under galactic convention, Firing on a diplomatic vessel during a ceasefire negotiation was considered an absolute violation of the rules of engagement. It was the kind of rule that worked perfectly when both sides had agreed to it. We had agreed to a great many rules in this war, and the Caith had broken most of them in the first 6 months. I had simply been waiting for the moment when breaking one of our own would matter most. I was not trying to destroy Athelfrith. I want to be precise about this. I was trying to end his ability to communicate, to move, and to follow us. His engines took 2 separate impacts. His FTL drive took 3. His communications array, as I knew it was the first thing to go. He was crippled, not destroyed. He was alive, and he was going to stay alive, and he was going to be very, very confused about what had just happened and completely unable to warn anyone about it. Lena, I said. Compartments locked, she said. Her voice was steady. I had always admired that. Engage the Casimir drive. The ship made a sound I had never heard before. It was not a mechanical sound exactly, more like a sound the air itself made when it was briefly uncertain about the physics of the situation. Then everything stretched in a way that I can describe but cannot fully explain. A sensation of being pulled in a direction that did not correspond to any direction that normally existed, and every light on the bridge flickered twice, and then we were somewhere else. Ethel Station sat in front of us, enormous and bright, its running lights reflecting off the hulls of dozens of docked Keth vessels. The defense grid was there, the sensor arrays were there, the fuel depots stretched out along the station's lower ring like enormous bright cylinders. For approximately 4 seconds, nothing happened. The station's defense grid did not respond because the defense grid's targeting system was not designed to track a vessel that had appeared inside its own perimeter from inside a gravity well, because that was not something that had ever happened before. 4 seconds, Nina, I said. Already working, she said. We did not fire at the station. We did not fire at the docked vessels. Every shot, every torpedo, every point defense burst was aimed at infrastructure, the fuel depots, the dry docks where Keth warships were being repaired, the logistics relay nodes that process supply routing for 63 active fronts, the command and coordination arrays that told those fronts what to do and when to do it. We were not there to end lives. We were there to sever the nervous system of the Keth military operation in one strike before anyone had time to understand what was happening, before any of the 63 fronts could be warned or rerouted or resupplied from a backup source. The defense grid came online at the 5-second mark. Return fire began at the 8-second mark. I watched my remaining hull integrity drop with the detached focus of someone who has accepted the mathematics of a situation and is simply executing the plan. At the 9-minute mark, with the fuel depots burning in the way that fuel depots burn when they are very large and in a vacuum, and there is nothing to contain the energy, Lena said something that I had not allowed myself to hope for. Commander, something is arriving in system. I looked at the navigation display. Ships dropping out of faster than light travel in a spread pattern around the system's outer edge. Not Caithar ships. The configuration was wrong for Caithar ships. The approach vectors were chaotic and individual. The way human ships moved when they had come from different directions and were not yet organized into a formation, human ships. 37 of them. I recognized 4 of the transponder signatures immediately. Commander Helen Burke on the Aldgate Bridge, Commander Kwame Akampong on the Meridian, Commander Ingrid Larson on the Northern Star, Captain Felix Drummond on the Providence, who I had assumed was dead because his last reported position had been in the middle of a Cathar assault. Not dead, none of them dead. They had received my signal. They had decoded the Volkov coordinates. And they had come. They were battered. Every single ship on my display was showing damage signatures. Several were running on what I estimated to be emergency power. The Northern Star was missing what appeared to be her entire aft section and was somehow still flying. These were not fresh ships. These were ships that had been pushed to the absolute limit of what ships could endure, crewed by people who had been pushed to the absolute limit of what people could endure. They were here. Anyway, the defense grid, which had been focused on us, had a new problem. 37 new problems approaching from 37 different angles, and the logistics relay nodes it would normally use to coordinate its response were in the process of being dismantled by Nina Diaz and Battery 7. I watched Athos Station begin to lose its structural cohesion. I watched the supply lines it maintained begin on my strategic display to go dark one by one. I thought of 63 Cathar assault groups somewhere across human space, waiting for orders and resupply that were not going to come. Then on my emergency frequency, a voice came through. It was recognizable even through the static and the damage to the communications array. Smooth, translated, controlled, but different from how it had sounded 6 hours ago. Something had left it, you said. Voice said from his crippled cruiser, still somewhere in the Karov corridor. Light years behind us. You said you would accept the terms. I looked at my bridge crew, Owen at communications back from engineering, Petrov watching his reactor readouts, Lena with her hands steady on the navigation console, Nina not looking up from her weapon station, doing what she did, what she had always done, with total focus and total competence. I activated the return channel. I did say that, I said. I never said I had finished the sentence. I closed the channel. 3 weeks, that was how long it took for the situation to go from what it had been at Athol Station to what it was now, which was something that would have been difficult to predict from that bridge 3 weeks ago, when I was running on recycled air and cold determination and the knowledge that what I was attempting was the most probable thing I had ever tried. 3 weeks, and now I was sitting in a cargo hold. It had been converted as cargo holds sometimes are in situations like this into something functional. There was a long table. There were chairs. There was lighting that was better than the emergency lighting I had been living under, but still not quite what you would call comfortable. There was water in a pitcher at the center of the table, and no one was drinking it. On my side of the table, me and Helen Burke and Kwame Akampong and 3 others from the surviving fleet command group. On the other side, the Caith, not Athol Vreth. He was somewhere far from here, presumably writing a very long and very uncomfortable report to his government. The people across the table from me now were Caith military commanders. I could tell the difference from diplomats immediately. Diplomats carried themselves with deliberate ease, as if they had never considered the possibility of the conversation going in a direction they did not want. Military commanders were more honest than that. They carried themselves with the awareness of people who had just had something important demonstrated to them. The senior commander across from me was named Keith Voruth, which was how Keith military titles translated. His equivalent rank in our system would have been something between admiral and supreme commander. He was very large and very still, and his bioluminescent markings were dimmer than the ones I had seen on Keith. In better circumstances, I had learned enough about Keith biology by this point to understand that their bioluminescence responded to emotional state. Bright meant confident or excited. Dim meant something else. He looked at me for a long moment before speaking. You understand, he said through the translator, that what happened at Athol Station is unprecedented in the history of Dominion military operations. I understand that, I said. 63 active operations have been suspended or collapsed due to supply disruption. 4 of our primary logistics chains will require months to rebuild. Several of our commanders in the field had no information for 11 days because every relay in their sector was dark. I understand that too, I said. You were dying ship, he said. It was not an accusation. It was something closer to a genuine attempt to process information that his existing frameworks were not fully equipped to handle. Your vessel was operating at a fraction of capacity. You were outnumbered. You had no support. Every tactical analysis would have projected zero probability of offensive action from position. I looked at him. Every tactical analysis, I said, was written by someone who has not spent enough time studying what humans do when their probability of survival is low. He was quiet for a moment. Helen Burke, to my left, said nothing. She had agreed before this meeting to let me lead the opening. Helen was one of the sharpest strategic minds I had ever worked with, and she knew exactly when to speak and when to let silence do the work. We are prepared to discuss terms, Keth Vorlag said. Genuine terms, not the terms that were offered to you in the Karev corridor. Different terms. I know, I said. I expected that. He looked at me with an expression that, through the translation of his facial structure and bioluminescent patterns, I read as something between respect and wariness. You expected this outcome, not this specific outcome, I said. I expected that if we survived long enough to demonstrate a genuine capacity to strike inside Dominion space, the nature of the negotiation would change. And if you had not survived, I thought about that. I thought about Reactor 3 coming back online at 61%. I thought about Nina outside the hall in a suit with a socket wrench. I thought about Tors with his thumb in the air from a ventilator mask. Then I would have made it as expensive as possible for the next person to try. I said. Keth Vorlag was quiet again. His markings pulsed once, dim and slow. We do not fully understand your species, he said. I know, I said. Most species that encounter us for the first time do not. It is, as you have seen, a significant tactical liability. What should we understand? He asked it as a genuine question, not a rhetorical one, which surprised me. I considered it. When things are going well for us, I said, we are much like any other species. We calculate, we negotiate, we weigh costs and benefits. But when things are going badly, something changes, the calculation does not become simpler, it becomes different. The cost of failure stops being something we weigh against the cost of action because we have already accepted the cost of failure, we are already paying it. What remains is only the question of what we do before the accounting is complete. Keth Vorlag said something to his companions in untranslated Keth. I did not know what he said, but two of them shifted in their seats. You are describing, he said slowly, a species whose probability of escalation increases as their probability of survival decreases. Yes, I said. Precisely that. Another silence. Helen Burke reached forward and poured water into a glass, which was the signal we had agreed on before the meeting. It meant now we negotiate. We negotiated for 9 hours. It was not pleasant. It was not the kind of thing that anyone at that table was going to remember fondly. There were moments when Keith Vorath pushed for terms that I refused, and moments when I pushed for terms that he refused, and moments when the whole thing went so quiet that you could hear the ventilation system and nothing else. But we got there. Human space would remain human space, all occupied. Territories would be vacated within 60 days. Prisoners of war would be exchanged within 30. There would be hard border clearly defined in a joint monitoring body to maintain it. There would be reparations, not symbolic ones, paid in resources and technology. Over a period of years, there would be no more discussion of protected species status or Keith governance over human civilization. That particular conversation was over. It was not peace. It was too early, too fragile, too carefully worded to be called peace, but it was the beginning of the architecture of peace, and that was more than I had dared to allow myself to expect when I was sitting in a damaged command chair, listening to Athwolf tell me how generous the terms were. After the Keith delegation had been escorted out, Helen Burke sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling of the cargo hold. Do you think they will hold to it? She asked. I think they will hold to it as long as they believe it is more costly not to, I said, which means our job now is to make sure they always believe that. No rest for us then. There is never rest, I said. There is only the distance between the last difficult thing and the next one. She laughed, which was unexpected. It was a real laugh, not a polite one. You are extraordinarily cheerful for someone who has not slept properly in 3 weeks. I'm not cheerful, I said. I am satisfied. Those are different things. She looked at me and nodded slowly. What will you do with the ship? I thought about the Sveatea Smrt, my ship, my damaged, scarred, stubborn ship that had carried us through things that ships were not designed to survive. I thought about Petrov patching her together with determination and expertise and the kind of focused energy that kept old machines running long past the point where anyone would have written them off. I thought about the 14 sections and the names inside them. I am going to fix her, I said, and then I am going to fly her home. Outside somewhere in this system, supply ships were loading, the first convoys, heading back to human worlds that had been cut off and under pressure for months. There were people out there who had been waiting a very long time for what was almost coming, and what was coming was finally heading in the right direction. I went back to the bridge. Lena was at her station. Petrov was at his. Nina was cleaning her console with the careful attention of someone who loved her tools and maintained them accordingly. Owen was at communications, monitoring 16 different frequencies as he always was, Commander, Lena said. Without turning around, course, I sat down in my command chair. Outside the converted cargo hold, visible through the viewport if I leaned slightly left, was a sky full of stars. Home, I said. Take us home, Athos Vreath somewhere. Across the galaxy in a very quiet office was writing his report. He had been writing it for 3 weeks because it kept coming out wrong, which was to say, it kept coming out accurate, and accuracy was the problem. He had tried 3 different openings and none of them said what he needed to say without also saying something that would be deeply uncomfortable for the people who would read it. He finally wrote it straight. The vessel designated UES Svyatea Smirt, under the command of a human designated Yevgenia Sorokina, was by every available metric a ship in terminal condition. Power output was below threshold for offensive action. Crew complement was at less than half capacity. No support was within tactical range. Standard analysis projected 0 probability of meaningful resistance and high probability of negotiated surrender. Standard analysis was incorrect. The vessel demonstrated combat capability from a position of near complete degradation. Commanding officer accepted a ceasefire window and used that window entirely for tactical preparation. She transmitted a strategic order to scattered fleet elements using a communication channel that required resources her vessel was not expected to possess. She deployed an experimental propulsion system in a manner not recommended by any existing operational guidelines. She then struck the most critical logistics target, Dominion space, from a position inside its own defensive perimeter, inflicted infrastructure damage that has required 3 weeks to begin quantifying, and coordinated the simultaneous arrival of 37 additional vessels from locations across the engagement zone. At no point in this sequence did she behave in the manner that was predicted. This office has conducted a thorough analysis of the failure and assessment and has reached the following conclusion: we were applying the correct framework to the wrong species. For most species encountered in Dominion diplomatic history, a reduction in material capability corresponds to a reduction in willingness to escalate. The calculus is straightforward. Less power means less action. A species in a weakened position negotiates because it must. It accepts terms because it cannot afford to refuse. Humans do not operate on this calculus. The relevant research suggests that humans have a documented cognitive and behavioral pattern in which the acceptance of loss, rather than dampening the drive to act, redirects it. When a human individual or group has internalized the possibility that they will not survive a situation, the resources that would otherwise be directed towards survival calculation are freed for a different purpose. Question changes from whether they can win to what they can accomplish before the situation ends. This makes them extraordinarily dangerous in precisely the conditions where they appear most vulnerable. The recommendation of this office, filed for all future diplomatic and military engagements with human civilization, is as follows: do not interpret human losses as indicators of human capability reduction. Do not mistake human exhaustion for human compliance. Do not offer terms that they did not request in conditions that they did not choose with a timeline that you control and under no circumstances should you give them 6 hours in which to prepare a response. They will use every second. Back in a cargo hold turned command center, turned negotiation table, turned the first room. In the architecture of something that might eventually become peace, I stood at the viewport and looked at the stars. They were still cold, still indifferent, still beautiful. The ship's engines were warming up. Petrov had them running at 80%, which was better than any of us had a right to expect 3 weeks ago. Convoy was forming up in the distance, slow and careful, heading toward people who had been waiting in the dark. The Iron Widow was not dying anymore. She was going home. I want to tell you the thing they never understand, the thing. Ath Avrith was still working out the language for in his report, the thing that every species seems to encounter exactly once and then never forgets. We have been dying since the beginning. That is not a weakness. That is the entire point. From the first moment a human being stood up in the dark and looked at the fire instead of running from it, we have been a species acquainted with the possibility of ending. We have built entire civilizations in the shadow of that possibility. We have made art about it and written songs about it and sat with each other in the dark and held each other through it, and then we have gotten back up every single time, not because we are stronger than the things trying to end us. Sometimes we are not because we are smarter or faster or better armed or more ruthless. Sometimes we are none of those things, but because we have a relationship with the end that other species do not share. We are not afraid of it. We are not comfortable with it either. We simply know it the way you know an old opponent, and knowing it means we are not stopped by it. We light something on the way out, and then more often than not we do not go out at all. The stars did not answer. They never do. I turned away from the viewport, walked back to my chair and took us home.